Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our fourth and final virtual fieldtrip.com TimeLooper civil rights field trip. In some ways, this is the capstone on a journey that we've taken both across the month of February, but also across history. And we're very, very excited today to have two living heroes with us, Miss Gwen Carrington and Miss Verdell Dawson. Both active members of Historic Tabernacle Baptist Church in Selma, Alabama. We are going to be having a conversation today that takes us back to the post-antebellum period up through the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, with some contemporary reflections on the progress that we have or have not made since 1965. Today's conversation will be facilitated by TimeLooper creative associate Rashida Wyndham. And so I will pass it off to Rashida. The floor is yours.
Hey, and thank you, Andrew, and thank you all for joining us today. It is our final capstone webinar here, and we've had such an exciting journey learning from a lot of different members that we've had, as well as we're talking to some real lives heroes here as well. And so Ms. Verdell and Ms. Gwen, thank you so much for joining us here today, and thank you all for diving in with us today. So I believe, should we get started?
Yes, we are excited.
Yes.
Great.
Thank you for inviting us. Thank you for inviting us.
No problem, and the honor is all ours. So just to get started, first, we cannot properly anchor the 1960s voting rights movement without understanding the importance of the post-antebellum period. Can you explain the progress African Americans made in achieving representation in Congress during the Reconstruction period, and what led to the reversal of that progress?
Well, I want to go back a little ways first, before the antebellum period and the Reconstruction, and we need to go to the period of slavery and look at Selma at that particular time. Selma, Alabama is located in the heart of what is known as the United States Black Belt and Alabama's Black Belt, and it is known for that particular reason because of the rich soil, but also because of the concentrated of slaves that were in that area. In Dallas County, we are in the center of the state. We're 50 miles from Montgomery, and we're about 80, 90 miles from Birmingham. And also maybe about a 2-hour drive from Mississippi and 4 hours from Atlanta. So that kind of gives you an idea of where we are. But more importantly, we were truly an agrarian society, meaning that the entire economy of Selma, Dallas County and the Black Belt was based upon the work and the labor of slaves. And that is the environment in which the antebellum days occurred. So with the passing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the freeing of the slaves, etc., then freedom came. However, it was an economic assault because all of the slave owners who had owned slaves before, this was their livelihood. And so they no longer could produce the crops primarily of cotton and corn because everything was set on a plantation where you worked for the slave owner, and then you also lived on the plantation in a shack, and you went to the store on the plantation and the prices were jacked up higher. So it was a complete cocoon, I would say, that you were in on your particular plantation. So once the Emancipation Proclamation occurred and the slaves were set free, the slaves were excited about it, but the slave owners were, of course, not excited. So they had to do something. And the way in which what they did was to establish what we now know as Jim Crow laws, saying that reinstituting the hierarchical system of slavery, whereas the white people, regardless of whether they were slave owners or not, the white people had more rights and superiority to colored people. And we're using the term colored because that was the historical term that was used for African Americans at that particular time. And again, that was a type of intimidation and a type of discrimination. So it is in that kind of a setting that that we're dealing with in Selma and Dallas County, Alabama. After during the Reconstruction period, there were several persons, and in Selma we have a congressman who was African American who came from our area, and there were Congress people who from Alabama who also were representatives. But again, we're talking about a culture in which everybody has lost all of their freedom and primarily their livelihood. So the Jim Crow laws, as I mentioned, were set in place in order to restore things to the usual way of life.
And just to add to that, even before then, when we talk about that antebellum period, you know, many of us, and I know that, you know, I had to do a little research myself, but Black Americans actually voted in large numbers across the South with the passage of this new Reconstruction Act. And actually they, as Blacks, they had a total of about 22 Black men who served in the Congress, in the US Congress, and 2 in the Senate. But with the uprising of the Ku Klux Klan and the white supremacist group, that they enacted intimidation and violence among Blacks. And Selma had one of the largest chapters of the Ku Klux Klan. So these laws were on the books. And truly the legal system was just up against us. It was just stacked against us. And so while that the 15th Amendment barred the voting rights, it was the states, it was the state laws and how specific they were that gave problems and issues to why Blacks were not able to progress as much as they could.
And so that just brings me to the kind of history of Historic Tabernacle Baptist Church. So it seems like it was founded a decade after the end of Reconstruction. Can you tell us a little bit about how this occurred and how Tabernacle influenced the community in Selma?
Well, Tabernacle was founded as an outgrowth of what is now Selma University. And Selma University was established by the, we would say, the colored people who had at one particular time had been slaves, but now they had been free, and many of them were becoming educated and so forth, and they realized the importance of education. And so Selma University was established as a school to educate the ministers, primarily Black ministers, Black Baptist ministers in Selma and the state of Alabama. And they were looking around for an educated person to be the president, especially one who had earned a doctor's degree. And that person who became the second president of Selma University was Dr. E.M. Brawley, Edward M. Brawley. So he, in his, along with his team, had developed a curriculum in which they talked about how a church should be organized and what practices that should be carried out in that particular church. And they wanted to combine the church and the community, and to be able to have a school that was going to carry out the practices that were taught in the school. And so that's how Tabernacle came to be.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so interesting, again, to see these types of connections, specifically with the African American church, as well as faith is very important within our culture, as well as education. It seems that a lot of our first colleges, first educational institutions are stemming right out of that kind of growth in community. And to talk a little bit more about it, I was just doing a little bit of reading about Historical Tabernacle, and David West was, I'm assuming he was, not assuming, he was the architect that, and a congregant of Tabernacle Baptist Church. And what was interesting is that he created identical entrances. Can you explain about why this is important and overall the kind of construction of the church, and why is it important for Black congregants?
Well, as we said that we are in the era of Jim Crow. And during the era of Jim Crow, Tabernacle is centrally located about at that particular time, maybe 5-6 blocks away from downtown Selma, which is in Broad Street. We are at the corner of Broad Street and Mentor Avenue in Selma, Alabama. Broad Street is the main street in Selma. It is US Highway 80. So we do not know exactly how we were able to acquire that particular piece of property, but we do know that the church itself, the church edifice that stands today, was built in 1922, and that was under the pastorate of Dr. D.B. Jemison. And Dr. D.B. Jemison was president of the largest African-American Black organization, and he had a special relationship with President FDR. So there were business between, from what we have been researching and finding, between the little White House in Georgia and Tabernacle. And we think that it is because of that connection and other connections that Tabernacle had. Tabernacle, as historically as a church, as we said, was established to further the education of not only the students at Selma University, but the surrounding community. So therefore, most of the members were educated themselves. They were your professional people. And that brought some privileges, because that way they could go to select persons in the white community and talk to them about, well, can we buy this particular piece of property, et cetera, and things would happen. But in the case of Dr. Jemison, as I said, and then with David West, who was the architect during that particular period of time, because Dr. Jemison wanted a sanctuary, or he wanted a building that would reflect what he called the magnificence and the glory of Christ the Savior. So the two, I guess we can say, somewhat collaborated in terms of that vision. And David West, though, knew that being on Broad Street and Mentor Avenue, that the colored congregants could not use the front doors of Tabernacle on Broad Street because of Jim Crow laws. They could only be used for funerals. So the Black congregants had to use the Mentor Avenue side. And so therefore he built what we say is social justice into the building itself, so that we have two parallel entrances on Broad Street and Mentor Avenue.
And just to add a little bit to that, as Verdell was saying, I think that with its members and the community as a whole, Mr. West thought about that social justice being embedded into the minds, into the souls of the people who were members at that time. And this having, with Blacks not being able to actually even walk on Broad Street, and if they were walking, if a white person was walking on that same sidewalk, the Blacks would have to leave the sidewalk, step away from the sidewalk to give them passage before they return to the sidewalk. So with all of these Jim Crow laws, with all of the misfortunes, as I would say, having those two entrances being the same, provided the members and the congregation with this self-work. They say you may, in other words, you may take this part from me, but my inner spirit and everything that is within me still knows that this is mine. This is mine. It was our ancestors. It was our great grandparents and our parents. They were the ones who persevered during this time, and to have that with that, have them to have that type of a mindset, that God would not fail them, is something that we continue to believe as at this time. We may not have the same types of hindrances, but we still have that mindset and that spirit to dwell on and to do good for the kingdom of God.
Right. And it's interesting because you're seeing that a lot of the times that we have this separate but equal, and most of the time, as we know, that that's not actually the case. But to see David West actually say, well, it will be equal, is kind of really a slap in the face of Jim Crow laws at the time.
Exactly.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And
Exactly.
so please speak to the evolving dynamic between Black and white communities in Selma during Jim Crow, during the first half of the 20th century. How did those dynamics shape the need for the role of the church in the Black community?
I think it did it in an I use the term awesome, but it was imperative that we look at it in that sense, because everything was fine for the whites. It was reported that the sheriff, who was Jim Clark, it was in 1963, he was quoted as saying Selma was the greatest place in the world to live until 1963. He said whites were not allowed to drink from Black water fountains, so vice versa. In other words, Blacks shouldn't be allowed to drink from the white water fountains. So now it was ingrained in them, in the mindsets of them, and so the church gave its members and the community a place of safety, a place where the church really solidified Dr. King's belief in nonviolence, and it built into its members and the community this pride of self-identity, where not only the word of God was preached and taught, the spirit of Black history, the leadership. Many leaders came out of Tabernacle. They are what we call unsung heroes that came out of Tabernacle, not only Tabernacle, but the community as a whole. And wherever we went, and I say we because we were a part of that. I was 11 years old in 1963, and even at that age, not knowing a lot of maybe not understanding too, a lot of what was going on, there was still this thing that it was instilled in me that I could be what I wanted to be. I could become any person that I wanted to become. And it was because of being a member of the Black church, as we call it, to give me and others that spirit of endurance.
And I would only add that at that particular time, when we were growing up, it was always home training first,
Mm-hmm.
then church training,
Mm-hmm.
then school training.
Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't and it was a continuous continuum. So there was nothing but negativity coming from the white community. And so therefore the church gave Black people or colored people a chance to be able to be important. We talked about the separate and equal entrance. You had leaders, you had deacons, you had trustees, you had a church clerk, you had other persons who took on leadership roles within the church that they could not have in the community. So there was value there. And everybody taught each other. So it was an ongoing process of lifting up each other within the colored community. And that's one of the things that we think that we have lost today, is that we don't have that connectivity one to the other.
And just to tie in kind of this understanding, and for our audience listening, is that, again, I would like to, highlight that this is only 60, 70 years ago. This is not, as we normally see within the history books, it seems like such a long time ago, but it's within your lifetime, my parents' lifetime, my grandparents' lifetime, that, we've experienced these issues, and to see the kind of policing essentially of you're getting it from when you leave. As soon as you walk out of those church doors, you're kind of having to go into a situation where you don't feel important, where you don't feel secure, where everything around you is telling that you're not. And so to bring that kind of more into the concept of voting rights, although African American—
Can I just add something to that, to also give a little bit more context? When we were in school, we always had to get the secondhand textbooks. And there was a particular store in town where everybody went to get their textbooks. And there was a separate entrance for colored people, even in the 1960s. And we had to go into the basement, and all of the textbooks, and we had to buy the textbooks, but they were all second-handed. And when you looked at it, you could see that at least 6 or 7 persons had purchased this or had used this textbook before. But there was one thing that we always were taught, and that is that you have to be better than. Know your history, and in order to be successful, you have to know more. You have to do more. Better than, not in the sense of superiority, but better than in the sense that you have to, your 2 times effort is only worth their 1 time effort. So you have to compensate.
And so just to see that compensation happening and bringing that into kind of voting rights, is that although African American men were given the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, and white women shortly followed after in the 19th Amendment, Black men and women were barred from the polls from the first half of the 20th century. How did whites in the Jim Crow South keep African Americans from voting? Can you give us some examples of how this occurred?
Well, I can start off. There was a lot of intimidation and violence, as I stated before, that the whites, with the uprising of the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacists, the states, those laws was, like I said earlier, was stacked against us. And so even though the 15th Amendment barred voting rights discrimination on the basis of race, it left the door open for states to determine the specifics of how a Black person could qualify to vote. So this included, things like asking Blacks to recite the Constitution, or to take a literacy test, or to count the number of jelly beans in a jar. All of these, and there are many more, but these were the Jim Crow laws from the 1800s that even in Selma prohibited us, even as we were children, when we could not go to public parks, we could not use what they called the white water fountains, and there was separate water fountains. And the input there, my mom, when we had to go to a store, I remember so vividly how my mom would not allow us. She said, "You have water at home. You won't use either of these water fountains." But we couldn't use the elevators, cemeteries. He had to add. They were asking Blacks to count the number of bubbles in a jar. And in some cases, if the few Blacks who were allowed to vote had to be recommended by someone, and that was usually a white person that had to recommend them to be given the opportunity. So those obstacles were there front and center, and those were the things that we had to live through, but yet come through. We just didn't stay there. We worked to come through those things.
And of course, there was also what's called a poll tax
Yes.
that you had to that had to be paid once you finally were allowed to be registered. And many persons, we have documented proof of many persons who went to be registered 6 to 8 different times before they were finally successful. And that was because they had designated certain days, maybe one day a week, for colored people to be able to come and register to vote. And it would be limited hours. And they had already predetermined that, okay, on today, no matter how many persons come to attempt to register to vote, we're only going to allow, say, 5 persons to vote, or to get the registration to vote.
Mm-hmm.
And so these inequities are starting up, what we like to say, with the civil rights and voting rights movement. And to push a little bit further into the decade, mass meetings, just to kind of contextualize this question, is that a lot of the times within our history books and our lessons that we're learning about the actual events that happen, we don't learn about the preparation that's needed and the work that actually goes behind it. Sometimes it just seems like protests or movements or events that we learn about spring up, and then we learn a little bit about that, but we're not understanding kind of the concept of what led to it and all the preparation and work that it took. So mass meetings were an essential part of the success of Alabama's civil rights campaign. And Tabernacle has a very long history in facilitating and leading these mass meetings, some in secret and others in light. Please speak on Tabernacle's history of these meetings and their importance.
Well, the Tabernacle was the host for the first mass meeting for the voting rights movement, but the way in which that mass meeting came about is that beginning in the 1920s and in the 30s, that we had members of our congregation who were teaching members of the community how to register to vote. We had one particular member who sent out a call to several churches to ask people to come to Tabernacles, and at that time we considered it to be the basement. And because our church does have three levels, and one of them, of course, is underground. We now call it the fellowship hall. But there was, out of all of the invitations that were sent for persons to come, at the very first meeting, there was one elderly man who came to learn how to register to vote. But the problem was that he could not read, nor could he write. So therefore, this particular church member, Mrs. Marie Foster, worked with him to teach him how to read and to write, and then eventually how to register to vote. So those classes continued, as I said, from the 20s and the 30s until in 1963 is when some of this surfaced. And it surfaced upon the death of Mr. Sam Boynton, who was one of the early civil rights leaders in Dallas County. And he and his wife, Mrs. Amelia Boynton, were very, very active in organization. And when Mr. Boynton passed, and by that time we had a young upstart who had come to Selma, and that young upstart was Bernard Lafayette, who was the organizer from SNCC, the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee. And Bernard Lafayette connected with the Boyntons and their association and their affiliates. And they said, well, we want to have a memorial service for Mr. Boynton. And the memorial service will be a mass meeting as well as the memorial service. And so that was the very first one that we had.
Mhm.
And so would you consider this maybe one of the beginnings of the catalyst of events that led to the church's involvement in the march from Selma to Montgomery? And then can you talk a little bit about Tabernacle's impact in these marches?
Mhm. Well, I can say yes, it was. And of course, not only Tabernacle, but Tabernacle played a very huge part in this, because just like before the 60s, it was Tabernacle was viewed as a place of refuge, if I can say, where we as the oppressed people could find safety and support, and that support in an example that Verdo just gave, that finding, being able to have a camaraderie or solidarity and affirmation while they were growing in a place that we call in the grace of God and the knowledge of God. And so when we look at the Black church and when we look at Tabernacle in itself, and being able to provide the support for the community, I can remember reading from one of the foot soldiers, and the foot soldiers were a group of boys and girls, men and women, young men and women, from not only the Black high school, which was, at the time was R.B. Hudson High School, but from some of the other high schools. And in his book, he talked about being able to, when we would leave school, they would leave school and they would have the meetings. And those meetings were mostly about training and preparing themselves for what was to be ahead. Yes, it was a fearful time. And he talked about being afraid, being scared of what would happen the next day. But Tabernacle had opened its door. And with the doors being open, those students, one group of students, or maybe several, were able to go down into the fellowship hall, which was the basement part of the church, to actually to have those meetings and to study and learn more about Dr. King's nonviolence. So I think that certainly we played a part in that.
And again, just to kind of place into kind of events about what's leading up to it. So those who learn about Bloody Sunday only typically learn about the events that happened on Edmund Pettus Bridge. Could you tell us a little bit more about the events the day or the day of the bloodshed? I think it'd be very interesting to hear kind of your thoughts on what's happening.
Well, first of all, as Gwen just referenced, we have to understand that the voting rights movement was really a youth movement. We had a high school that was segregated. There was a white high school, and then there was a Black high school, and the Black high school was R.B. Hudson High School. And the students had watched their parents go into businesses and so forth, and they knew the type of jobs that their parents had. They were primarily, I can remember my grandfather was the only job that he could get was to be the janitor at a hardware store in downtown Selma. In fact, that hardware store stood right at the foot of the bridge. And they saw the disrespect. When we went to the stores, there was a separate entrance, as I mentioned earlier. And then there was also a designated colored person who had to wait on you when you went to the high-end stores. And if you wanted to try on shoes, you had to, if they allowed you to try on shoes, you had to put a newspaper or some type of piece of paper in the shoe in order to try it on. And the same thing would be with a hat. So it was a constant intimidation, a constant telling you that you don't have value, that you are
Right.
a second class. And so the students said, well, we want a better life for ourselves, and we really want to find a way to deliver a message on behalf of our parents. So the students at R.B. Hudson High School connected with Bernard Lafayette, as we mentioned earlier. And so they walked out of the school in mass and held a series of mass meetings, starting first at Tabernacle, and then of course moving to First Baptist Church, and then to the Brown Chapel Church. And but that was really the impetus for the voting rights movement.
I was one of those students, even though I was very young, and my parents had not 100% given me and my sister, who was there at the school, also permission to walk out, for we had heard the day before that something was going to happen. But I felt, and we felt deep down in our hearts, that we could not, of course, our teachers could not tell us to remain in the classroom, neither could they tell us that we had the permission to go. And so I decided to leave with this large mass of students. And I'm glad that I did, for I know that I realized shortly after, really, we were all scared. We were scared that our parents would have something to say, and scared of what was in front of us. But, demonstrations had been going on for at least 2 years before Bloody Sunday. And young people usually are less fearful, of course, than their parents. Of course, we were afraid of our parents losing their jobs. There were members who had death threats and intimidation of all sorts, And so while the whites wanted to keep that fear in us, we wanted to stand tall and to make a difference. So simply put, we knew that people had already been killed, because at that time, Jim Lee Jackson had been murdered. There were several others who had been murdered. And as that day approached, there were many meetings, and when I say meetings, these were meetings that were training the students how to approach the march, how to walk 2 by 2, how to step. And as one person was saying, they were partnered up, they were 2 by 2. And so they were told, do not leave your partner under any circumstances. And there was a time, the one person that I remember reported that when his partner, the tear gas, was just flowing everywhere. Tear gas was getting into their noses and mouths, and so and eyes. And all of this was going on, and the state troopers were beating them with billy clubs and just kicking and knocking, and people were falling all over the bridge. And his partner was hit, knocked down. And as he was running, trying to make cover, he remembered that his training says, do not leave your partner. Do not, don't leave your partner. And he looked around and went back and grabbed his partner and threw his arms around his partner so that he could make it. They were trying to get to what we call the bed of the river, so that they could get some water to wash out their eyes. And so there were a lot of instances like that. But the boldness and that was instilled in a lot of the young people during that time carried on with them, and they are all over this United States now, continuing to tell their stories in books and in seminars and just being a part, so that we don't, because what's happening is that we are not teaching our children. And so that is why we are so happy to be able to do this, because this is something that they really don't learn in the classrooms. And so we need to teach our children about the struggle and about how important it is to stand up for what is right.
And that's a great segue into my next question. In our previous webinars, we've explored the idea that the church was such a central force for the civil rights movement. And how does Tabernacle Baptist Church continue in the similar vein of social justice and voting rights act? I know you both have mentioned that it's embedded kind of in the bedrock of Tabernacle. What are the lasting legacies of Tabernacle Baptist Church? And what can we learn from you both about how to navigate our current, I like to call it the second iteration of the civil rights movement we're in now?
But one of the things that we're doing, because we have so many former members of our church who participated in the, sorry about that, who participated in our, in the voting rights movement. So we're telling their story. These were brave, courageous persons who stood up to Jim Clark, who stood up to the Ku Klux Klan. And we're telling the story, not only to our children, but we are telling the story to the nation, to the world, because we want them to know about them, because they are indeed brave soldiers. They're role models who had far less than what we have today. But they persevered and they sacrificed. There were homes that were burned. There were families who had to leave town because of the stand that they took. And so once the story is told, then we know that the future generations and the current generation will continue to learn from what their courage was, and then they can pass it on to everyone else.
Mhm. And yes, to add to that, Tabernacle is a Black church. And I, when I was younger, I used to struggle with that term, a Black church. I would say, we're just a church. And I learned what it means to be a Black church, because there's a difference between a Black church and a church with Black people in it. And we need to recognize that a Black church was born out of systematic oppression as Tabernacle was. And Tabernacle was born out of so many different facets of where we've become today. And it still is that place that is a refuge where oppressed people can come. We may not be oppressed in the same manner, but likewise we are oppressed, and we can find support, and we can find safety. And so you have a term, we have our way of saying it. Our mission, our goal in TAB is that we are ignited with passion, and we inform our minds with the Word of God and with social justice issues, so that we can be abreast. And then we go out and impact our community, so that we are not just in the four walls of Tabernacle. And I must give credit to Verdia. Verdia is the chairperson of our legacy committee at the church. And she has done a wonderful job of putting together the history of our church. And I know that she's still in the process of doing it, and we're working together with her. But she has been very instrumental in doing that and getting us to the point where we are. So we're not just standing still. We're continuing to move forward, so that the world will continue to know, because we can't forget. Some people say we need to forget it. Just forget it. It's over. Forget it. And but we can't. If what is the term? If you don't remember where you come from, you can't move forward. You can't move forward.
And I would also like to add that in this Black Lives Matter, one of the things that our pastor did that was courageous, as I mentioned, we are right on Broad Street, and anybody who comes to Selma passes our church. And he was daring enough to put up a Black Lives Matter banner between the pillars of the columns of our church. So, and he got some pushback on that.
Mhm.
There was a couple of articles that was written in the local newspaper by one of the white ministers in town, who thought that we had been duped by the Black Lives Matter, and that we didn't understand what it meant to be Christian because we were in support of the Black Lives Matter. So Tabernacle is still courageous today. And, we're committed to community outreach and lifting up people, whatever their conditions are, because our church motto is that we are where Christian stewardship and social justice intersect. It is
Yes.
because of our faith and because of our beliefs that we are rooted in Christianity, but our arms, they uplift instruments that we use.
Mhm. And let me just say very quickly here, that with that sign, that banner, that Black Lives Matter banner hangs in the on Broad Street side again, as Verda has said. But I think about it's that place where we couldn't enter. It's right over the door where we were forbidden to enter back in those days. And so it is visible, and taking that stand by our pastor today was a very courageous thing to do.
And just to talk a little bit about voting registration and movements, Clarice Jones asked, does the church participate in voter registration in addition to ongoing education?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. We start with our members, of course, and then reaching out into our community. Our community, Tabernacle is situated on the corner, like we were saying before, Broad Street and Middle Avenue. My home is about where I grew up is about 2 blocks over from the church. And it is a community that is on the verge of dying, if I could use that term. Young people have left the homes that their parents have left to them, and we have a lot of dilapidated houses in the area, and so reaching out in our own community and trying to encourage our friends, our associates, those persons in the community to register to vote, and to make sure that that they understand it. We have mass meetings every year with the reenactment of Bloody Sunday, and this year, of course, it will be virtual. But our church is packed on those Thursday nights, where persons from all over the country come, but our community come as well. And it's always a time when we lift our voices, but we also talk about the importance of the right to vote, and making sure that we don't lose it. I think, Verda, you may have mentioned earlier about the fact that we have a lot of young Blacks who don't prioritize it, that they, because we haven't told our story, because they don't understand it. We have a lot of of young parents, and we've lost some of that intrinsic desire to vote, and we've seen some differences here in the last few years, but we're still working on that, and it's an ongoing thing that we have to continue.
But the other thing that I'd like to add too is that, and COVID hit us on this, is that we are in the process of doing an annual observance of that very first voting
That's right.
mass meeting. And
Mhm.
in addition to the voter registration projects and activities that we have, we had a municipal election this past summer, and Tabernacle was instrumental in having an outdoor candidates forum, and all of the persons
Yeah.
who were running for office came to this forum in order to be informed, so that everybody would know, for whom they should vote and why they should vote for each individual candidate. So we are definitely a very vital part of the community, and we are regarded as one of the churches to look to for progress. We're known as a progressive church in Selma.
And another question came in from Mark Smith. The 6 principles of Kingian nonviolence are considered powerful by many people. He asked, how are the Kingian nonviolence principles incorporated today?
Well, I would say that we continue to have a connection to the community. Coming from a history of a church that had a particular focus in terms of education, so that many of the members of the church were not always from the grassroots. They were persons who were professional. These were your teachers, these were your doctors, these were your lawyers, your college professors. So there was privilege there. But now, interfused with that are persons who were in the grassroots, and because of that, they brought what we would call the common man into the tabernacle story. And so today, Tabernacle continues to reach out to the common man, not only from outside but from within, because our congregation today is a mixture of diverse persons from. Well, in the South, we don't have a lot of racial diversity, but we have a lot of, I would say, class diversity.
Those are important to highlight. So it looks like we are about 10 minutes over. I'm not sure if there's any more questions, but it's been so wonderful having Ms. Riddell and Ms. Gwen here, both telling us more about your story, and as well as Historic Tabernacle Baptist Church. And we thank you so much for honoring us here and speaking with us about your story.
It was our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
And for those that are still watching, if you would all like, we do have virtual field trips that partner with a lot of our previous members and participants that we've had here. And as I believe Andrew's showing on the screen here, you can go to virtualfieldtrip.com and you can be able to sign up and hear more directly from our participants that have been speaking throughout Black History Month as well. So we thank you so much for being a part of this journey with us. And we thank you again for joining us. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. And again, I also like to note that within our Black History Month webpage, which will still be up throughout the entirety of this year, because we believe Black History Month is just not important just to February, it's throughout the year. You'll be able to read those as well as also please download the Historic Tabernacle Baptist Church app that's located, and you can just search that up under TimeLooper, and then you'll be able to see that as well. So we'd love you to download the app and learn even more virtually through the app that we've created in partnership with Historic Tabernacle Baptist Church. So we thank you all so much for joining us. I hope you all are staying safe and healthy and putting your mind before all things. And thank you very much for joining us here today. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Riddell. Bye.